The house was quiet. The kind of quiet that echoed off the walls and through the hollow spaces. It wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. Richard sat in his favorite armchair, his gaze fixed on the muted television screen in front of him, but his mind was elsewhere, wandering down paths he was too afraid to follow. The soft hum of the air conditioner was the only sound that filled the room, a constant reminder of how little had changed, despite everything. Outside, the world moved on, but inside their home, time felt as if it had come to a standstill. Charlotte sat across from him, her fingers absent-mindedly flipping through a magazine, her eyes not really seeing the pages. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, a wall they both refused to acknowledge, but neither could ignore. He had tried for weeks to break through, to bridge the distance. But each attempt fell flat, like a conversation with a stranger he didn't know how to talk to anymore. Richard couldn't remember the last time he had felt this far apart from her. This estranged. Charlotte hadn't always been like this. He remembered a time when she was his everything, when every glance, every touch, was filled with purpose and desire. They had been young and in love, full of promises and dreams. But now, even when she was sitting in the same room, it felt like she was a world away. "Olivia's going to her friend's house for the weekend." Charlotte's voice broke through the silence. Her words were casual, but there was a coolness to her tone that Richard couldn't ignore. "She's been asking to spend more time with her friends lately. She's growing up fast." Richard nodded absently, though his mind wasn't on their daughter. He hadn't been able to shake the feeling that something had shifted in Charlotte for months. At first, he thought it was just the pressures of life, the strain of work, motherhood, and the endless responsibilities they had accumulated over the years. But the distance had grown like a slow-moving storm, and now it was undeniable. He wanted to ask. He wanted to confront her. But the words never came. Instead, he simply smiled, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah, she's not a little girl anymore," Richard said quietly, though his heart wasn't in it. "We're not little kids either. I guess that's just how life goes." Charlotte's gaze flicked up from the magazine, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment before she looked away. There was something in her eyes, something he couldn't quite place, that made his stomach turn. But instead of addressing it, she turned back to the magazine, as if nothing had happened. As if everything was fine. But Richard wasn't fooled. The unease had been building for months. He couldn't remember the exact moment it had all started. He couldn't pinpoint the date when their once vibrant connection had begun to wither. But one thing he knew for sure, Charlotte wasn't the same. She had changed, and he had no idea why. His thoughts began to wander, and it wasn't long before they settled on the one thing he had been avoiding: Margaret. Margaret was Charlotte's best friend. They had known each other for years, ever since college, and there was something about her that always felt too familiar. Too comfortable. Charlotte and Margaret's bond was deep, unshakable, it seemed. But recently, Richard had noticed the way they exchanged glances, the little moments of laughter that felt more intimate than they should have been. The way Charlotte's eyes lingered when Margaret walked into a room. It all seemed too much. Too close. Richard had been feeling uneasy about it for months, but it wasn't until a few weeks ago that he stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold. He had come home early from work one afternoon, planning to surprise Charlotte with dinner, but the surprise had been on him. Margaret had been at the house, sitting across from Charlotte at the kitchen table, their heads close together as they whispered in hushed voices. Richard had caught only a fragment of their conversation, but it was enough to make his heart stop in his chest. He heard Charlotte say, "I never thought I'd feel this way, but I do. I don't want it to end." The words were enough to send him into a spiral of confusion and suspicion. What was Charlotte talking about? What had she meant? His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to make sense of it. He'd considered confronting her right then and there, but the moment felt too fragile, too volatile. Instead, he stepped back, unnoticed, and watched as Margaret left the house. It wasn't long after that Richard's suspicions began to grow. The tension between Charlotte and Margaret had changed. The air between them had thickened, filled with something unsaid, something dangerous. Richard could feel it, even if he couldn't quite explain it. Charlotte's behavior had become erratic. She was distant and distracted, her moods unpredictable. The once loving woman he had married was slipping away from him, and all he could do was watch. But still, he didn't confront her. Not yet. The days after that afternoon weighed heavily on Richard. Every time Charlotte was near, he could feel the tension between them, thick and uncomfortable. It wasn't just that something had changed, it was that everything felt wrong now, as if the foundation of their relationship had cracked, and nothing would ever be the same again. The house, once a sanctuary, had become a place he wanted to escape. But there was nowhere to go, nothing to do, because he was already tangled in a web of doubt and confusion. He had tried to act normal, to fill the spaces with meaningless conversations about Olivia's schoolwork, or about the weather, but all the while, his mind raced with unanswered questions. What was Charlotte hiding? Was it the stress of life, or something more? One evening, after dinner, Richard found himself alone in the living room, the glow of the television flickering on the walls. Charlotte had disappeared upstairs, claiming she was tired. He didn't believe her. The exhaustion she claimed was far too convenient, and the way she had retreated into herself had become a pattern. Every night, she would pull away just a little bit more, as if she were building walls he could never scale. It was late when he heard the knock at the door. He stood up, surprised by the sudden interruption, and walked cautiously toward the front. Through the window, he saw Margaret's familiar figure standing in the dim light. She was early tonight, far earlier than usual. Richard opened the door, forcing a smile. "Margaret, what's up? Something wrong?" Margaret's eyes were wide, her lips pulled into a tight line. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" she asked softly. He hesitated. This wasn't a conversation he had been prepared for, but he couldn't ignore it either. He stepped aside, allowing her in, though every fiber of his being screamed to refuse. "Is everything okay?" Richard asked as they both moved into the living room. Margaret seemed on edge, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. "No," she said, shaking her head slowly. "No, everything is not okay. And I'm not sure how to say this, but I think you need to know what's been going on. I don't want to be the one to tell you, but you need to hear it from me." Richard's heart skipped a beat, his throat tightening. "What do you mean?" Margaret swallowed, her gaze darting toward the staircase where Charlotte had disappeared just minutes ago. She leaned forward slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want this to happen. I didn't plan for any of it. But your wife. She's been seeing someone. And it's not just someone, it's me." Richard's blood ran cold. His mouth went dry, and for a moment, all he could do was stare at Margaret, unable to comprehend what she was saying. "What?" he managed, his voice shaking. "I'm sorry," Margaret said, her voice cracking. "I never meant to hurt you. This started out innocent, just late-night talks, something we both needed, but it got out of hand. I never meant for it to go this far, but it has." Richard felt like the room was spinning. He wanted to shout, to scream at her for betraying him, for betraying everything they had built together. But he didn't. Instead, he just stood there, the weight of her confession pressing down on him, suffocating him. "I should have told you sooner," Margaret continued. "But I didn't know how to. I don't know how to make it right." Richard's mind was reeling, trying to process everything she had just said. His hands shook as he placed them on the back of the chair, using it as a crutch. He could hear the sounds of the house around him, the faint creak of the floorboards above, but all he could focus on was Margaret's words. "Your wife's been seeing someone." He should have known. He had seen the signs, felt the distance between him and Charlotte grow, but hearing it out loud shattered something inside him. It wasn't just an affair, it was a betrayal so deep it left him speechless. I don't know what to say," Richard stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Margaret looked down at her hands, her face flushed with guilt. "I never meant for it to happen, Richard. I swear to you, I never wanted this to go this far. But when Charlotte came to me, it felt like we were both searching for something. And I didn't stop it. I couldn't stop it." Richard clenched his fists, his stomach churning with the realization of how long this had been going on, how long Charlotte had been slipping away from him and into someone else's arms. He felt betrayed not just by Margaret, but by Charlotte, the woman he had loved for so many years. "I'll leave," Margaret said suddenly, her voice trembling. "I'll leave. You don't have to see me again. But you deserve to know the truth." Richard stared at her for a long moment, his mind torn between anger and sorrow. "No," he finally said, his voice low and hoarse. "You've said enough." Margaret nodded, then stood, turning toward the door. As she walked out, Richard couldn't bring himself to say another word. The door clicked softly behind her, but the sound felt deafening. He sank into the couch, his head spinning. He needed to confront Charlotte, needed to hear it from her, needed to know just how far this had gone, how much she had kept hidden. The truth of their marriage was unraveling in front of him, and the weight of it was suffocating. An hour later, Charlotte came downstairs. She looked surprised to see him sitting there, his expression unreadable. "Richard?" she asked softly, her voice cautious. "What's going on?" He stood up slowly, feeling the rage inside him start to boil over. His words were a low growl, barely controlled. "How long, Charlotte?" he asked, his voice trembling. "How long has this been going on?" Charlotte's face drained of color. "What are you talking about? Don't lie to me," Richard snapped. "I know about you and Margaret. I know everything." Her eyes widened, then narrowed, as if she were trying to process the words. Then, a look of resignation passed over her face. "Richard, how long?" he demanded again, his voice shaking with anger. "A few months," she said, her voice barely audible. "It wasn't planned, it just happened. I don't know how to explain it. It was a mistake, and I regret it. I didn't want you to find out this way." Richard's heart shattered. The pain was raw, consuming. "A mistake? Charlotte, you're telling me it was a mistake?" She flinched, her eyes welling up with tears. "I don't know what to say anymore. I've been trying to make sense of it too, but I can't. I've hurt you so much, and I'm so sorry. I don't want to lose you." Richard shook his head. He couldn't process her words. He had never imagined this, never imagined that his life would be turned upside down by the woman he loved and trusted. The woman he had spent years building a life with. The woman who was now pregnant with someone else's child. "You don't want to lose me?" he repeated bitterly. "You already did, Charlotte." She sobbed, the tears falling freely now. "I don't know how we got here. I never wanted this. But now it's too late. I don't know how to make it right." Richard stared at her for a long time, his heart torn between anger and sorrow. He loved her, but how could he ever look at her the same way again? How could he ever trust her again? "You're pregnant," Richard said, his voice hollow. "And you didn't think to tell me that? You didn't think I deserved to know?" Charlotte took a step forward, her hand reaching out toward him. "Please, Richard. Please don't leave me." But he couldn't hear her. He couldn't focus on her pleading anymore. All he could hear was the echo of Margaret's confession. All he could feel was the betrayal, the broken trust. "I can't do this," Richard whispered, his voice breaking as he turned away. "I need to figure out what's next, Charlotte. I don't know if we can fix this." And with that, he walked out of the house, leaving everything behind. The affair had destroyed them both. But now the real work would begin, figuring out what came next, if anything. Could they rebuild their broken marriage, or was it too far gone? Richard spent the night at a nearby hotel, the sterile whiteness of the room offering no comfort. The muffled sounds of the city outside filtered in through the window, but inside it was quiet, too quiet. He lay on the bed, staring up at the ceiling, his mind replaying every moment of that conversation with Charlotte. He tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. He was too awake with the overwhelming tide of emotions crashing over him, too aware of the choices that lay before him, choices that he wasn't sure he was ready to face. The next morning, Richard got up early. He wandered aimlessly through the streets, trying to clear his head, but everywhere he looked, he saw reminders of everything he had lost. Families walking together in the sun, couples sharing quiet moments, all the things he had taken for granted, all the things he no longer had. He could feel the weight of his own guilt, of the way he had failed to see the signs. He had been blind to the distance growing between him and Charlotte, the cracks in their relationship that had been widening for months. And now it was too late to fix it all. He walked to a small cafe, the familiar scent of coffee in the air offering a momentary distraction. He sat by the window watching people go by, trying to find some sense of clarity. He picked up his phone, staring at the blank screen for a moment before unlocking it. The missed calls from Charlotte stared back at him, each one a silent plea, each one a reminder of how much he had lost. His thumb hovered over the screen, torn between calling her back and leaving things as they were. But it wasn't just the affair that haunted him, it was the pregnancy. The realization that Charlotte was carrying someone else's child was like a physical blow. How could he ever accept that? How could he live with the idea that their marriage had become a lie? He made the call. When Charlotte answered, her voice was tentative, fragile. "Richard, I'm here," he said, trying to steady his voice. "We need to talk. Where are you?" Her voice quivered, the hurt in her words unmistakable. "I'm at a cafe," he replied, his gaze shifting out the window. "I'll be home soon." He hung up without another word, the finality of it echoing in the silence. He sat for a long time, staring at the cup of coffee in front of him, unsure of what to do next, unsure of what he was even looking for. Answers, maybe. Or just the strength to face what had happened. To face Charlotte. When he returned home, the house was eerily quiet. The walls, once filled with the sounds of their life together, now felt suffocating, almost foreign. Charlotte was sitting on the couch, her face pale and drawn, her hands folded tightly in her lap. When she looked up, her eyes were red-rimmed, but she didn't speak. Richard stood in the doorway, his body tense, as if bracing for impact. "I never wanted this," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted to hurt you." "I know," he replied, his voice soft. "But you did, Charlotte. You really did." Her lips trembled as she wiped away a tear, looking down at her hands, unable to meet his eyes. "I've been so lost, Richard. So lost in everything, our routine, our life, the pressure of it all. And I thought that if I didn't do something, I'd lose myself completely." Richard's chest tightened. "And you thought sleeping with Margaret would help?" Her head snapped up at the mention of Margaret's name. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It was a mistake, Richard, a huge mistake. I never thought it would come to this." "And the pregnancy?" Richard asked, his voice cold despite the ache in his chest. "How does that fit into the mistake?" Charlotte's face crumpled, her tears falling freely now. "I don't know. I don't know how we got here, Richard. I just wanted to feel alive again. I didn't know where else to turn." Richard clenched his fists, his jaw tightening with each word. "You should have turned to me," he said quietly, his words biting, though there was a sadness in them. "But you didn't. And now I'm left here, wondering what's real anymore." "I never stopped loving you," Charlotte whispered, her voice breaking. "But I didn't know how to love myself." Richard stepped forward, his face a mask of pain and frustration. "You have to love yourself, Charlotte. And I have to figure out how to love myself again, too. Because right now, I don't know who I am in all of this." She reached out for him, her hands trembling. "Please, Richard, don't leave me. Don't leave us." He looked down at her hand, his own instinctively pulling back. "I don't know if I can stay, Charlotte. I don't know if we can fix this." "I'll do anything," she pleaded. "I'll go to therapy. I'll make it right. Just don't give up on me." Richard shook his head, his throat tightening as he struggled to speak. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Charlotte. I don't know if I can move past what you've done." Her face crumpled in despair. "Please don't say that. Please don't leave me like this." The silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of their shared pain. Richard stood there, rooted to the spot, trying to decide what to do next, where to go from here. Finally he spoke, his voice raw. "I need space, Charlotte. I need time to think." Charlotte looked up at him, her face pale and tear-streaked, but she nodded slowly, as though she understood. "I understand. Take all the time you need." Richard turned and walked out of the room, his steps heavy. He wasn't sure where he was going, or even if he had a destination in mind. But the house felt too small, the air too thick. He needed to get away, even if it was just for a moment. Outside, the cool night air hit him like a slap in the face, but he welcomed the chill. It was better than the suffocating heat inside the house, better than the suffocating weight of the past few days. He needed to breathe. As Richard walked down the street, his mind raced. Could he forgive Charlotte? Could he find a way to rebuild their life? Or was this betrayal the end of everything they had? The questions swirled, but the answers felt elusive, slipping through his fingers like sand. He stopped by a small park, sitting on a bench, his hands in his lap. He thought about Olivia, about their daughter, and how this would affect her. He thought about the life he and Charlotte had once shared, before the lies, before the secrets, and he wondered if it was even possible to go back. He didn't know. And that was the hardest part. Not knowing if what they had was enough to survive the storm they'd both created. Inside, Charlotte sat on the couch, her hands still trembling in her lap. She couldn't stop crying, but she also couldn't stop thinking about the conversation they'd had. She knew Richard was hurting, and part of her blamed herself for the distance that had grown between them. She had made a mistake, a huge one, but she had never stopped loving him. But love wasn't enough, was it? Not anymore. As the night wore on, the distance between them felt greater than ever. The silence stretched, and in it, she found the space to question everything. Could they make it work? Would they ever be able to heal the wounds that had been inflicted, or was their marriage too broken to fix? The answers weren't coming, and so they waited. Both of them, in their own separate worlds, unsure of what the next step would be. The next few days passed in a haze of uncertainty. Richard continued to keep his distance, retreating further into himself as he struggled to find a way forward. He went to work, and while his body moved through the motions of his daily life, his mind remained elsewhere, heavy with the weight of Charlotte's betrayal. Every time he saw her, it was like a physical jolt, a reminder of everything they had lost. They spoke only when necessary, their words strained and distant. Charlotte, on the other hand, was lost in her own turmoil. She had begun attending therapy sessions, trying to come to terms with her actions, But no amount of counseling could erase the guilt she felt. Every word, every glance Richard gave her felt like a judgment, a silent condemnation. But despite everything, she couldn't stop loving him. She couldn't stop wishing for things to go back to the way they had been, when their love was simple, uncomplicated. But as the days wore on, it became clearer that they were stuck in an endless loop of pain, unable to move forward or backward. Richard had promised to try, but what if trying wasn't enough? One evening, after an especially long day at work, Richard returned home to find Charlotte sitting at the kitchen table, her face drawn and tired. The air between them had thickened in the past week, and he couldn't remember the last time they had shared a meal or a moment of connection. "Hey," he said softly, unsure of what to say. His heart was heavy, but his words felt inadequate. "Hi," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't look up, her eyes fixed on the mug of tea in front of her. He hesitated for a moment, then walked over to her, leaning against the counter. "How was therapy?" he asked, though the question felt hollow, as though they had both already known the answer. Charlotte's fingers traced the rim of her mug, and she let out a long sigh. "It's hard," she admitted. "But I think I'm starting to understand why I did what I did." Richard's chest tightened, and he felt a pang of anger mix with his grief. "You're understanding it now?" he asked, his voice rising without meaning to. "After everything?" Charlotte flinched, her eyes filling with unshed tears. "I didn't know how to fix it, Richard. I didn't know how to fix us. And then I made a choice. A terrible one." Richard closed his eyes, running a hand through his hair. He could feel his patience slipping away, replaced by the flood of raw emotion that had been building for weeks. "We both made mistakes, Charlotte. But this feels like something we can't come back from." Charlotte stood up slowly, her legs shaky as she moved closer to him. She reached out, her hand trembling as she placed it gently on his arm. "Please, Richard. Please don't say that. I don't want to lose you. I can't lose you." Her words cut through him like a knife. He wanted to believe her, he really did. But the wound in his chest was too deep. He had never expected her to do this, to hurt him this way. And the idea of her carrying another man's child, a reminder of everything they'd lost, was more than he could bear. "I don't know if I can do this anymore," he said, his voice low and hoarse. The words tasted like ash in his mouth, but they felt true. Charlotte's face crumpled, her tears spilling freely now. "I know I've hurt you," she sobbed. "I know I've ruined everything. But I need you to understand, Richard, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I never meant to betray you." He looked at her, his heart aching, but he couldn't bring himself to reach for her. "I don't know what you want from me, Charlotte. How do I trust you again?" "I don't know," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But I want to try. I want to show you that I'm still here. That we can still have something, even if it's different." Richard didn't respond immediately. His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, each one more confusing than the last. Could he try to rebuild what they had? Could they ever get past the betrayal, the lies, the affair, the pregnancy? Or was it all too broken to fix? He turned away, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know if I can believe that anymore," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. Charlotte's breath hitched, and she took a step back. "I'll wait for you," she said, her voice firm but filled with sadness. "I'll wait, Richard, for as long as it takes." Richard didn't answer. He couldn't. The silence between them was suffocating, and as he left the kitchen, he couldn't help but feel that the distance between them had only grown wider. It felt like they were standing on opposite sides of a vast chasm, both of them reaching out, but unable to bridge the gap. The days that followed were filled with small moments, conversations that circled around the same painful truths, glances that lingered a little too long, and gestures that felt like the last remnants of a relationship that had already started to fade. Charlotte continued her therapy, and Richard went through the motions of his life, but nothing felt the same. Every moment was tinged with the weight of what had happened, and no matter how hard they tried to make things work, they couldn't seem to break free from the suffocating tension that hung in the air. One afternoon, Richard decided to take a walk to clear his head. The weather was crisp, the sky a brilliant shade of blue, but he felt disconnected from it all. He walked aimlessly through the neighborhood, past the houses and the parks, until he found himself standing at the edge of the lake, staring out at the water. The sound of the gentle waves lapping against the shore brought no comfort. It only reminded him of the stillness in his heart. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Charlotte. "I'm sorry for everything. I'm trying to change, but I need you to know that I love you." Richard stared at the screen for a moment, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He wanted to respond, to tell her that he loved her too, that maybe there was still hope. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he deleted the message without replying. He had no answers, no way to fix what was broken. All he had was the uncertainty of the future, and the overwhelming feeling that the person he was now was no longer the person he had been just a few months ago. He turned and began walking back home, the weight of everything pressing down on him. Would he ever be able to forgive Charlotte? Would they ever be able to rebuild the trust they had lost? Or was this just the beginning of the end? As he walked through the front door, the silence of the house greeted him once again. Charlotte was sitting on the couch, her eyes red from crying, but she didn't look up when he entered. Richard stopped for a moment, staring at her, wondering if he had it in him to keep going. To try again. "I don't know what's next," he said quietly, his voice breaking the silence. Charlotte looked up at him, her eyes filled with hope, but also with fear. "Neither do I," she admitted softly. "But I'm still here, Richard. I'm still here, and I'm still fighting for us." And so, they continued to stand at the crossroads of their relationship, unsure of what the future held, but unwilling to give up just yet. Richard stood there in the doorway, torn between the woman he had loved for so long and the betrayal that still cut deep into his heart. Every part of him wanted to turn away, to walk out and never look back, but another part of him, a part he wasn't sure he trusted anymore, still held on to the faintest thread of hope. Hope that perhaps this wasn't the end. Charlotte stood up slowly from the couch, her movements cautious, as though she were afraid to make a wrong move, to say the wrong thing. Her eyes never left him, desperate for a sign, for something to reassure her that they weren't too far gone. "I'm here, Richard," she said softly, her voice trembling. "And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything. But I love you. And I need you to understand that this thing between us, it wasn't about not loving you. It wasn't about you. It was about me. And the mistakes I made, I can't undo them. But I want to make things right. I want to fight for us." The air between them felt charged, a heavy silence hanging in the space. Richard didn't know what to say. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, of old memories, of feelings that couldn't be turned off like a switch. He loved her. He always would. But could he look past this? Could he trust her again after everything that had happened? "You want to fight for us?" he asked quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "What does that even mean, Charlotte? How do you fight for something that feels so broken?" Her face fell, but she didn't look away. "We start by being honest," she said. "We start by not pretending it's all okay when it's not. We face it together. We work through it piece by piece. And if that means starting over from the ground up, then that's what we do. But I'm not going to walk away from you. I'm not going to let this," she gestured to the distance between them, "be the end of us. Not unless you want it to be." Richard closed his eyes for a moment, the words weighing on him. There had been so much time lost. So many nights spent in silence. So much pain that lingered long after the events had passed. But even with everything that had happened, a small part of him still couldn't shake the love he had for her. It was buried deep, hidden beneath layers of hurt, but it was still there. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know if I can forget everything." "I don't expect you to," Charlotte replied, her voice steady now, though there was an unmistakable ache in it. "And I wouldn't ask you to. But I want to be here. I want to prove to you that I'm not the person I was. I'm not that woman anymore. I don't want to be." There was a long silence between them. Richard took a deep breath, his heart racing in his chest. He had spent so many days trying to ignore the pain, pretending like it wasn't there, convincing himself that he didn't need her. But the truth was he still did. "Then we take it one step at a time," Richard said finally, his voice rough but resolute. "One day at a time. I'm not promising it will be easy. But I'm willing to try. For us." Charlotte nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She stepped forward tentatively, as if afraid of scaring him away. She reached for his hand, and after a long pause he took it, his grip firm but careful. "We're not starting from nothing," Charlotte whispered. "We're starting from here. From now." Richard nodded slowly, his heart heavy with everything that had come before but lighter than it had been in a long time. For the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't feel as though he was standing at the edge of a cliff. Maybe they could rebuild. Maybe it would take time. But for now, this was enough. Together, they stood there in the quiet, the weight of the past hanging between them, but also the faintest glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way back to each other. A way back to the love they had once known. The next few weeks passed in a delicate balance of progress and setbacks. Charlotte continued with her therapy, and Richard tried to open himself to the idea of healing, though it was clear that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. They spent their evenings talking, not just about what had happened but about their lives, their dreams, and their fears. For the first time in a long time, they communicated, truly communicated, and in those moments it felt like they were rediscovering each other. But even as they worked to rebuild, the shadow of the affair lingered. There were moments of tension, times when the past resurfaced, and their trust in each other was tested. Richard still struggled with the image of Charlotte with someone else, and Charlotte fought against the guilt that threatened to drown her whenever she looked at him. But slowly, ever so slowly, they found their way back. There were no grand gestures, no sweeping declarations of love. There were only small, everyday moments, the shared smiles over breakfast, the quiet hand-holding on walks, the soft whispers of encouragement when things seemed too hard. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And that was enough for now. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Richard found Charlotte sitting on the porch, staring out at the fading light. She looked up as he approached, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, he saw her truly smile. It was small, but it was genuine. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" she asked quietly, her eyes searching his. "We have," Richard replied, sitting down beside her. He took her hand in his fingers intertwining with hers. "And we'll keep going one day at a time." Charlotte rested her head on his shoulder, her heart swelling with the hope that had been so elusive in the past. They weren't fixed. They weren't perfect. But they were still here, together. And that was enough for now. Charlotte shifted slightly, her head still resting against Richard's shoulder. They sat there in the fading light, the silence between them comfortable, not like before when it had been thick with unresolved tension. This time, it felt like the beginning of something new, something they hadn't been able to see before the cracks in their relationship had finally forced them to face each other. Richard sighed, his chest tight, but not with the usual heaviness. It was different now, like a weight that had been there for so long was slowly lifting, piece by piece. They had a long road ahead of them, but there was something in the way Charlotte had leaned into him, in the way their hands still fit together, that made him believe maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back. "Do you think we can really make it work?" Charlotte asked, her voice soft, almost hesitant, but there was a warmth in it that Richard hadn't heard in a long time. "I don't know," Richard admitted, his fingers brushing the back of her hand. "But I'm willing to try. I'm willing to keep trying. We've both made mistakes and we've both hurt each other, but I believe we can still fix it. If you're willing to fight for us." Charlotte turned her face slightly, meeting his gaze. She gave him a small but sincere smile. "I want to. I really do. I've never stopped wanting us to work. It's just, I lost myself for a while. I lost track of who I was, of who we were. But I'm finding her again. I'm finding us again. Slowly." Her words were both heartbreaking and comforting, and they made Richard's chest tighten in a way that felt like both sorrow and relief. He knew what she meant. He had been lost too, in his own way. So wrapped up in the past, in the hurt, that he'd forgotten how to look forward, how to hope for what could be. He squeezed her hand gently, his thumb tracing the soft lines of her skin. "We'll figure it out," he said quietly. "We have time now. To rebuild. To heal. We're not in a rush." Charlotte nodded, resting her head back against his shoulder. She let out a slow, contented breath, and Richard could feel the tension leaving her body, just as it was slowly leaving his. Maybe they couldn't fix everything right now. Maybe they couldn't pretend like everything would be okay just because they wanted it to be. But they could start. They could start from here, from this moment, and take it one step at a time. And maybe, just maybe, they would find their way back to the love they had lost. The days that followed were small steps forward. They learned how to listen to each other again, how to be honest without the fear of judgment. Charlotte continued with her therapy, and Richard started attending sessions too, not because he had to, but because he wanted to understand himself better, to understand the part of him that had been so closed off for so long. They worked through the mess of their emotions, the anger, the hurt, the lingering distrust, but they worked through it together. There were still days when the past crept up, when the memory of the affair reared its ugly head, but they learned to talk about it, to not let it fester in silence. And when those moments passed, they found comfort in the quieter, simpler things. Cooking dinner together, sharing a cup of coffee in the morning, the easy banter that had once defined their relationship. One evening, about a month after their conversation on the porch, Richard stood in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. Charlotte was at the counter sorting through the mail, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Richard didn't feel the weight of the past pressing on him. He didn't feel the anger or the doubt that had once defined so many of their interactions. Charlotte looked up from the pile of letters and smiled at him, a real smile this time. "You're doing it again," she said with a laugh. Richard raised an eyebrow, confused. "Doing what?" "Chopping vegetables like you've got a knife in your hand and not a care in the world," she said, teasing. "You look like you're actually enjoying it."